Our final presenter this morning probably also needs no introduction, especially in this venue, which is kind of her home field. She's Lorrie Kim, and she's going to talk about her chapter rereading podcast, Harry Potter After 2020.
So the Harry Potter fandom loves a podcast. Who here has been on a Harry Potter podcast? Right? And if you have, you know that one of the reasons you do it is because you think that through the process of discussing it, you might work out some things that you've been wondering about yourself. Like, hopefully it'll happen. So a year ago, my friend JC and I launched Harry Potter After 2020, a chapter reread podcast covering one chapter a week. And we're up to the end of Prisoner of Azkaban right now. Ooh. We had noticed that in our communities, many longtime HP fans have been nervously avoiding the books since Rowling started campaigning against equal rights for trans people in 2019, which we call TERFpocalypse. What if you reread these books and you find that the magic is gone for you now? Or possibly worse, what if you find that you love them more than ever, despite who she has become? So we decided to call the podcast Harry Potter After 2020 because we want to see if the series reads differently to us after the catastrophic changes of 2020, not just TERFpocalypse, but from our US-based perspective, the fascist politics, the pandemic, the racist police violence, and the attacks on protesters. They all made us wonder what we would find when we returned to a series first published before the Columbine shootings, before 9/11, before a sitting US president refused a peaceful transition of power and incited followers to storm the Capitol like an invading army. The first thing we had to do was signal our stance on the author's transphobia at a glance. We hired fandom artist Fox Staccato, who in 2020 collaborated with me to design the graphic that's on my shirt right now. So we hired Fox to make us a logo for the podcast of a lightning bolt in Progress Pride flag colors, because this kind of signaling, as a response to the author's divisiveness, it's a fact of life in Harry Potter fandom after 2020. Whoever your people are within HP fandom, to me it seems like it's only fair to be upfront. Much of the time, our episodes are just chapter discussions like any other reread podcast, but we're also tracking when the story is so compelling that we forget about TERFpocalypse for a while, and when our anger at the author interrupts our reading. So I'm going to read out selected clips from 5 episodes. For the first chapter on The Boy Who Lived, I asked JC, did your awareness of Rowling's transphobia affect your reading experience this time? JC, yes. Previously, my read was that she was mocking people like the Dursleys. Now that's her. She's one of them. The way that Vernon Dursley looks at weirdos dressed in funny clothes, I thought she's become that. I had already been thinking for years about the story being about being queer, being different, and how society looks at people who are different. But yeah, that was like, how do you not see that you're becoming that? I was surprised at how hard it hit me from the start. Lorrie. One thing for me that's different reading it now is the celebrations. You know how the wizards can't help themselves and they're setting off fireworks and they're hugging muggles. When the 2020 election was called for Biden, even though COVID was still raging, a lot of people who had been isolating at home swarmed the streets in my neighborhood. There were drums going day and night. There's this one particular intersection where every time the light turned red, hundreds of people would swarm into the intersection and play music and dance. And then when the light turned green, they would all go back to the sidewalks. I have this on video. The other thing I understand differently, calling Voldemort he who must not be named and not wanting to say his name, I used to understand that in the literary sense, giving names power, blah, blah. I understood it differently when Trump was elected, and I realized I didn't want to say his name because having a person's name in my mouth is physical intimacy. It wasn't that I was afraid of his power, I was just repulsed. And then, after TERFpocalypse, enormous portions of the fandom, including me, just stopped saying her name. JC, yeah, I was reluctant to say her name during this. I kept calling her the author, using a pronoun. Lorrie, that was partly because if you say somebody's name, that's an intimacy. Maybe we need to erect some barriers. I'm putting a boundary here because I respect myself. I don't want to let you in. You've hurt me. You're not okay. You're dangerous. I don't have to let you in. In episode 112, JC and I had an intense discussion about Harry looking into the mirror of Erised and seeing a crowd of people, but not himself. Lorrie, the mirror of Erised, this incredibly powerful artifact that's about human longing and projection and selfhood, Harry thinks he's invisible like he has been. He thinks he has no reflection, no identity. It's quite different from that. His desires have been made real. JC, the idea of what you would see when you look in the mirror became another, what house would you get sorted into kind of thing. There was always that idea of walking up to it, and then you really are faced with the question of, what would I see if I looked in the mirror? Lorrie, and inevitably, I had such a rage. This is the point in the episode where I'm aflame with rage about the author's transphobia. Because who is she to say what people see when they look in the mirror to see their own reflections and who they really are? This is yet another one of those magical selfhood tests that make this series so successful and resonant. People recognize the truth. You might be nobody, but no one but you knows what you see in the mirror. No one can tell you what to see in there, not even the author. JC and I had an epic episode about the Boggart in the Wardrobe chapter from Prisoner of Azkaban. This part is when I asked JC, who is a professor of education, training math teachers, for her professional response to Snape forcing Neville to feed a potion to his toad, and Lupin coaching Neville to show the class a vision of Snape dressed as Neville's grandmother. Lorrie, I ask you as an educator, JC, what Snape has just done, creating more and more fear in a student who's already struggling, and then forcing this staged production with the entire class as witness, testing whether or not he's going to harm his own pet that he doesn't want to harm. What would you recommend that a school do? JC, Snape has just given a master class in how to be cruel to a person who's powerless. And then Lupin gives a class on how to respond to that with more bullying. The kids are learning that here's how adults do it. There's so much that's wrong with that, but also that's real. In the United States, almost every state has a code of ethics for teachers that's written into the law for the most part. In the case of what Snape did here, that's 100% a firing offense, and lose your teaching certification and never work in this state or whatever as a teacher again. That's endangering the health and safety, and he's already done this a bunch of times, just the times that we've known in this book. Lorrie, if you were explaining to somebody, we are firing this teacher, this is exactly why, how would you put that? JC, I guess you point to the particular piece of the code. Typically, teachers will not endanger the health and safety of students under their care, mental health, physical health. It all comes down to don't touch the children, don't express anger at the children, keep your calm. Don't allow children to get bullied in front of you. All of that stuff, all of those things are things that teachers can lose their jobs over. And Snape has done every one of those things in this chapter, honestly. Lorrie, you have to stop this man from just being allowed to say anything he wants to these children. But do you have to stop it by getting mob mockery of him according to stereotypes that have to do with gender, with age, with attractiveness? How would you recommend that a school deal with what Lupin has just done? JC, I think once again we're at a code of ethics violation, but there's a lot of layers to it. It seems like the kind of thing where there would be some serious conversations with the teacher, but also with the students. And the teacher would have to then come back and talk with the students and say, look, I did this thing and I should not have done it. These are the reasons why, and let's talk about how you felt in that situation. Whenever you have an adult modeling behavior that is harmful and essentially teaching children how to cause harm, especially in the context of a lesson like this, it's a different vibe from Snape just being cruel to chosen people in his class. That's also horrible, but this is in the context of instruction, and instruction about something really important. So it feels like a lot of people would have to be involved in that, and it would need to be rectified. Lorrie, so is this transphobic, what Lupin has done? JC, I don't know how else to describe it. put a man in women's clothes and then mock that, and then you're using the word ridiculous, it's hard not to say that's transphobia. In episode 217, The Heir of Slytherin, we talked about how books contain the author at the age of writing and how books change according to who reads them. JC, when Tom Riddle created this particular Horcrux, it froze a part of his soul from when he was 16. So that part hasn't become Voldemort yet. He has these ambitions to do that kind of thing, but he doesn't know what's happening. He's learning what his fate is through the story of Harry Potter. I don't think I had realized that until I read it this time around. Lorrie, yeah, now he knows there's somebody that was at least as powerful as me. I have to meet this person. Learning that new piece of information from Ginny has rewritten the book so that the diary he originally wrote with the stated intention of just trying to get converts to his ideology and continue his mission of killing people, now has changed to a deeper yearning for somebody to talk to that might understand him so that he might not be alone. The way that 16-year-old Tom Riddle, the author, is feeding off of Ginny, this reminded me so strongly of Claire Dederer, the critic, in her book Monsters, saying that the experience of art, it's not about the author creating things, it's not about death of the author where the reader is the only person with the power, it's two biographies meeting. Ginny's needs cause her to interpret Tom Riddle's diary a certain way. The way she reads his diary changes the most urgent drive of the diary, meaning that her reading highlights an aspect of it that might not have been as important for other readers. She's reading her need and her yearning for Harry Potter into this. To say that that's what Tom Riddle, the 16-year-old author, is getting from her, it's really more like that's the message that this reader is extracting because that's the mindset she brings to reading it. The same document might have been primarily notable for shedding light on the origins of Voldemort's ideology. That's the main theme of Tom Riddle's diary. But because the reader happens to be Ginny Weasley, now this document has become primarily notable for clues about the person who tried to be Harry Potter's murderer and the way he was at a young age. The document has the exact same set of information that it always did when Tom Riddle, 16 years old, enchanted it, but Ginny's reading changed it. So here we are, looking at Harry staring at the orphaned boy who had grown up to murder Harry's own parents and so many others. And all I can think is how strange it would be now, in year 4 of Turfpocalypse, to go back in time and meet 1998 J.K. Rowling and realize that there's going to be a time when she's going to devote all of her energy into fighting against legal rights, employment rights, and healthcare access for trans people. What would that be like? Because it's not like I would want to stop her from writing the series. I want the series and all of the changes that it's created in this world. JC, scary too to think, couldn't that happen to anybody who's done this incredible thing and created something that's changed the world? Then could you turn on all of that and become a person who's actually now doing harm? Lorrie, yeah, and then the urge is to go back to the original text and look for clues. Were there clues all along? Should I have found them? So here we are with Harry finally deciding, oh no, you are not going to control us anymore, and piercing the diary with the fang. There was a long, dreadful, piercing scream. Ink spurted out of the diary in torrents, streaming over Harry's hands, flooding the floor. This is almost too literal to talk about, but it reminds me of the day in December 2019 when Rowling wrote such a transphobic tweet that the fandom had to repudiate her. The ink spurting out of the diary in torrents, all of the love and bonding that readers had poured into the relationship between ourselves, this series, and the person that we had constructed in our minds as the author, who had written back to us, not necessarily individually, although sometimes, but had created a phenomenon of an author-fandom bond over the years, giving interviews, writing in response, writing some fandom things into her books. This was a living relationship, and it was invested in with emotion from all sides, and mutual trust and affection. All of that ink spurting out from this severed connection of survival and rage and betrayal. Because if you were on the internet that day in the Harry Potter fandom, you would have seen Rowling send out that tweet. And then for the next 24 hours, one fan organization after another issued scathing, cold statements saying, no, if you are making us choose between our people and bigotry, I know what you gave us. I know what we owe you, but no, no. JC, also that feeling of, this is not what you taught us to do. Just last week, we released the episode on Cat, Rat, and Dog from Prisoner of Azkaban. This is an absolute masterpiece of a chapter. Wow. Lorrie, this chapter, I think, is probably what I and maybe a lot of people have in mind when we refute accusations that Rowling was never a very good writer to begin with. I can understand people wanting to say that to diminish her power, but we wouldn't be arguing about this if something hadn't captured a lot of people's imaginations. And I really disagree about her being a mediocre writer. In this chapter especially, we get to stand back in awe, I think, at how many layers she managed. JC, yeah, since we started this podcast, I've become so much more sensitive to seeing that. People say, oh, it's an awful series, why don't you read this instead? And they'll name something that I've never heard of. Yeah, I could read that, but I know it's not going to grab me like this did. There's this desperate need I keep seeing people have for denying that Harry Potter is good, for denying the power of it. We've talked at length about the impact it's had on our lives, on other folks' lives, and how important it is that you get to own that. With every episode, JC and I have learned this story, this series is robust. The characters and major themes stand up to a lot of analysis. The time-turner effect of rereading is intense. We remember ourselves from 20 years ago before JC and I, we now have children who are Harry's age mates. We remember how differently we read the story then. The process of doing one chapter per episode means we have confronted the fat phobia of the Dursley chapters instead of skimming them with our eyes closed. The fat phobia is worse than I let myself think, and no, that was not typical of the times. That's a JKR problem. Now that universities are outlawing critical race theory and eliminating certain departments, we see more clearly why Voldemort cursed the DADA position. It's easier to control people when you disrupt their learning of their own stories and power. We used to be shocked that Hogwarts was a mortal risk for students and nobody seemed bothered. Now, with school shootings being so routine that children have shooter drills and teachers are expected to shield students with their own lives, and armed school guards do little to prevent shootings but disproportionately punish students who are minorities, we are less naive about how Dumbledore could allow murderers in the school or the ministry could post dementors. Most of all, we have remained invested in the story, eager to read more. We can't wait to get into the intrigue of Order of the Phoenix, the Draco mind games of Half-Blood Prince, the ambitious mysticism of Deathly Hallows. So far, that is what we have discovered. This, with mixed feelings, it's a good story. So if you're curious about our weekly podcast, it comes out every Wednesday. I have stickers and badge ribbons out on the common table. And that's what I have.